Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chapter 13 screencast, which is going to cover the brain and our cranial nerves. So as far as development of the central nervous system, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I want you to know the major portions of our brain. So our brain is a part of our central nervous system within our cranial cavity, so basically within the skull. We have this serving as our control center for many of our body's functions. We talked about most of them on Monday. It's much like a computer, but we have more complexity to it. And we're still researching so much having to do with the brain and how it functions and how to make it really function better. So let's talk about the parts of the brain. And I'll show you this in another image, the different portions. We have the brainstem that's really connecting our spinal cord and our brain. It has in this area the integration of our reflexes needed for survival. Our cerebellum, this word literally means little brain. And this is involved in locomotion, so walking around, our balance, and also our posture. We also have right in the center of our brain our diencephalon, and this is made up of our thalamus, subthalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. A lot of thalamus words here. And then we also have the cerebrum, which is the main mass of the brain itself, and this is where all conscious thought is going to take place, and also where we have control over the things our body does. The other thing we're going to discuss are cranial nerves. I'm not going to go into too much detail as far as what I'm going to test you on your exam when it comes to cranial nerves. I am going to talk about the cranial nerves in this lecture for those of you that are interested, but like I said, I won't test you a lot on the cranial nerves. It's way too complex, and I don't think it's clinically relevant for your program. So our cranial nerves, even though it comes off of the brain, it's really a part of our peripheral nervous system because it's moving toward the outside. And we have two pairs that are going to arise from the cerebrum. The rest of these cranial nerves, the 10 pairs, are going to arise from the brainstem. So that means we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. But let's talk about the brain first. So here is a great sagittal section of the brain, and this is the view that you guys are going to have in the cadaver lab. So what I want you to notice is the cerebrum up on top here. All of this squishy, squirrely type of tissue, all of that is the cerebrum. Our diencephalon, you could see in the middle here. So here's our thalamus. That triangular shaped area is your hypothalamus. You can also see your pineal gland here. We'll see if we get lucky in lab if we can find one. You can see your brainstem here. That's this main mass. Here's your midbrain. Here's your pons. And below this area is your medulla oblongata. And this would be your little brain, the cerebellum. We also have this corpus callosum. I don't really talk about this in this lecture, but this is where we're going to have white matter crossing from one half of the brain, so let's say the left hemisphere of the brain, over to the right hemisphere of the brain. So pretty important area, but we don't talk too much about the corpus callosum in here. Also, let me mention you have a space here. This would be your lateral ventricle. We're going to talk briefly about ventricles too. And this is a nice little chart that shows you the subdivisions of the brain. Here's our brainstem, bottom is medulla oblongata, then we have the pons, midbrain. Reticular formation I also decided to take out of your lecture. I think I have just a sentence on it. It basically is your activating system to alert your brain, so it works within our sleep-wake cycle. Your cerebellum is right here. Diencephalon with your thalamus and hypothalamus would be there. And then we have the main mass as your cerebrum. So let's start on the brainstem. The medulla oblongata is going to be the most inferior portion down in here. And it's going to be pretty much continuous with the spinal cord. Like we mentioned in chapter 12, once we pass the foramen magnum, that big opening at the base of the skull, it's going to become the spinal cord. And both the spinal cord and the medulla oblongata have these ascending and descending tracts that move up and down through it in order to communicate up to the brain or other parts of the spinal cord. What the medulla is responsible for is a lot. It's regulating our heart rate, our blood vessel diameter, so whether it's going to vasoconstrict or vasodilate, respiration, so the way we breathe, swallowing, vomiting, hiccuping, coughing, and sneezing. Now our pons, I'll show you where that is here. So right above the medulla oblongata, okay, keep that in mind. Our pons is going to contain fiber tracts that are also ascending and descending, but I want you to know that it's responsible as a sleep center and a respiratory center that's going to coordinate with the medulla. So they both the medulla and the pons have respiratory centers. Now we have our midbrain. I'm going to go back to this picture. Our midbrain is just a small area in here, okay? And that was this area in here, kind of triangular shaped as well. And oh, it went too far. Here we go. And the main thing I want you to know is that this area, the midbrain, is going to contain a ton of nuclei. Nuclei, I don't want you to think of like a nucleus, like in a cell. Nuclei in our brain means that we have a collection of cell bodies within the central nervous system. Remember, what term did we use for a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system? If you said ganglion, you are correct. Okay, so that's cell bodies outside the central nervous system. We use the term nuclei for collection of cell bodies inside the central nervous system. So the main nucleus that I want you to know of is substantia nigra. And if you look at this slice, this is a cross-section slice, so we've taken the midbrain and sliced it this way, okay? We're going to see all these different pigmented nuclei in here, but that substantia nigra is important because it has to do with Parkinson's disease. In this region, it's going to be pigmented black because it's filled with melanin, and it's interconnected with our basal nuclei in our cerebrum, which we'll talk about shortly, and will function in motor control. Here is our cerebellum. It's that little brain, and it's found directly posterior to the pons. Well, I shouldn't say directly, because we have this space here. This space is known as the fourth ventricle, so keep that in mind for an upcoming slide. We have a gray cortex and nuclei with white matter tracts, so you can see that it's a little bit more pigmented white in here, and we call this white portion arbor vitae. It means the tree of life, okay, because we have these myelinated axons all coming together. And the cortex, which would be the gray matter, has these enfoldings, and we call those folds folia, and they really look like little leaves coming off of the tree. Our diencephalon is going to sit between our brainstem and the cerebrum, so it's really this middle portion of our brain. It does contain the thalamus, subthalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. We're just going to focus on the thalamus here and the hypothalamus. So our thalamus, what do I want you to know about it? Well, sitting in between the thalami, your thalamus, like you only see this oval shaped structure here. Okay, that's your thalamus and this little guy sticking out. If you were to look at this three-dimensionally, you almost like take two eggs and let's say you stuck like a little, I don't know, toothpick in between them. This is what your thalamus really looks like. You have one on the left and one on the right. So the view that we're looking at here, we've basically sliced this in half. And that's why you see that little guy sticking out here too. So what that's going to create is a space, okay? And that space sitting between the thalami is your third ventricle. Okay, so I'll show you guys this in the lab too. It's going to be a little bit hard to get the three-dimensionality of it, but know that medial, so more toward the inside, medial to the thalamus, will be the third ventricle. Okay, so what does our actual thalamus do for us? It's a sensory relay center. That means I have sensory information coming in to my thalamus, and my thalamus tells that information where to go. Somewhere in the cerebrum usually. Okay, another cortex. So that's why we call it a sensory relay station, because sensory information comes in and we relay it somewhere else. Okay, almost all sensory information has to make a pit stop at the thalamus. So it's a very important structure. Next, we have our hypothalamus, and you guys are already a little familiar with the hypothalamus because of our endocrine lecture. So just a reminder, that's found right in this region where we have all these colorful beads. These are representing nuclei. Sorry guys, it's the end of the day and I'm starting to lose my voice. So what we don't know about our hypothalamus is that we have some other structures, and one of them is going to be our mammillary bodies, and that's this bead right back in here. It's gonna bulge a little bit out, so I think this looks so cool in the cadaver lab because they really are just perky. What they really are, they call these mammillary bodies because mammillary refers to breasts. So they look like perky breasts sitting uh, in the brain, and they have olfactory reflexes there, meaning they're going to help us with the sense of smell and emotional response to odor. So that also kind of works because our mammillary bodies work within our limbic system, which has to do with emotions. So you know, there's always that rumor that women are more emotional, so it kind of makes sense the mammillary bodies are for emotion. Okay, we also have the infundibulum, which we've talked about. This extends on down from the hypothalamus, attaching to the pituitary gland. So that's assisting us with controlling our endocrine system. And some other functions for our hypothalamus is we're getting input from our viscera, meaning our organs in our body, also our taste receptors, limbic system, which I mentioned has to do with emotion, nipples, external genitalia, prefrontal cortex of the brain, efferent fibers, which by the way, efferent means the same thing as motor. Okay. This is going to be terrible, me trying to write this with my mouse, but that's actually not too bad. So that means motor. Whenever you see the word afferent, I just need to mention this real quick so there's no confusion. Okay, afferent always means sensory. So efferent and afferent are two different terms. Okay. And the way you're going to remember this is by remembering the word same. S-A-M-E. Okay. So S for sensory, A for afferent. I always like to separate these because this means the same thing, sensory and afferent. And motor and efferent mean the same thing. Okay. So we're also getting motor fibers to the brainstem, sending this information down back this way toward our brainstem. Also moving through our spinal cord, moving through our infundibulum over to the posterior pituitary gland and to our cranial nerves, which we'll talk about in a moment, controlling swallowing and shivering. It's also going to regulate mood, emotion, sexual pleasure, hunger, and rage, and also fear. And it's really working with a couple different structures, a couple different parts of our brain, like the amygdala and the hippocampus, in order to do all these things. So the hypothalamus really does communicate to our entire body. Next, we have the cerebrum. This is the largest portion of our brain. Remember, it's that upper portion that had all those squiggles all over it. And we divide it into left and right halves. We do have different lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and insula. Notice most of these are going to match up with the bone names that we learned in the beginning of the quarter. We also have different depressions in the brain, and we call these sulci or fissures. So I'm going to show you them on the next slide. We have the longitudinal fissure, separates the two hemispheres. Lateral fissure separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes, and our central sulcus is going to separate the frontal and parietal lobes. And just general terms for our cortex, so the outer portion of our brain is going to be gyri, which are the folds, and the sulci, which are the depressions. We already know that the medulla is going to have a respiratory center. It also helps with our heart rate and everything. Not sure why I put this in there, to be honest. So let's just cross this guy out. We do have communication with the medulla from our cerebrum, but we're not going to go into that. And our cerebrum also has nuclei. Remember, nuclei is a collection of cell bodies within the central nervous system. And it's made up of gray matter because it contains cell bodies. And we do have it within the medulla as well. Okay, so here are our different lobes. Now our central sulcus, oh, my pen went away. Our central sulcus, I'm going to show you where this guy is here. This central sulcus, let's switch our color to black, is found right over here. See how it's dividing the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe? I'll put an F here for frontal because I think my label got covered up. What this is also separating is a gyrus. Now let me define for you again what a gyrus and a sulcus is. A gyrus is going to be any part like this part here that's sticking up. So this is a gyrus, this is a gyrus, this is a gyrus. And a sulcus is this depression, the parts that are folding in. So here, I don't want to choose that area. Here's a sulcus in here, if you're following my pen. Okay. So back to our central sulcus. That's this depression right in here. And it's also dividing out our precentral gyrus, which we call our primary motor cortex. Okay, so it's this gyrus right in here. This is our precentral gyrus. Again, has to do with motor functions. This means information from this area is carried from a neuron down to our spinal cord, and then will go out, let's say in the upper limb. The other thing our central sulcus divides out is going to be our post-central gyrus. Make this white. Nope, not a good choice. And our post-central gyrus is known as our primary somatic sensory cortex. So all of our sensory information is found in here. All sensory information is found in here. So the way you can remember this is the motor always goes in the front of the car. So it's part of the frontal lobe. It is the meaning in front, central gyrus, okay, and sensory is in the back. Or you could remember alphabetical order. M comes before S. Now let's talk a little bit about these lobes. Our frontal lobe is highly involved in motor functioning, specifically voluntary motor functioning. So when you want to grab a glass of water, that's a voluntary movement. You're deciding to move your body. It also deals with motivation, aggression, sense of smell, mood, personality, and decision making. Sometimes the prefrontal cortex isn't completely developed as we're aging, moving toward the age of 18. So sometimes we still make some bad choices, bad judgment while this area develops a little bit more. We also have our parietal lobe, which you see in blue here. This has more to do with sensory information. So reception and evaluation of sensory information coming in, except for smell, hearing, and vision. They have their own separate pathways. We have our occipital lobe, which looks like my label for occipital lobe also got cut off. This is going to have to do with eyesight. So this is my occipital lobe all in red here. Anything having to do with visual input. And then we have our temporary lobe in yellow here. And this has to do with reception and evaluation of smelling, hearing, memory, abstract thought, judgment. And then we also, if we open up that area of the temporal lobe, we find our insula. And insula is our fifth lobe that not too many people talk about. It's really a primitive lobe. It's like a primitive brain that has all the basics in there. Okay, so I mentioned we talk about the basal nuclei. Again, collection of cell bodies in the central nervous system. So if I slice the brain in half, you're looking more at the cerebrum, although we do have parts of the, oh no, we don't in this picture. So here's our cerebrum. Our basal nuclei does continue to our diencephalon, which would be in this area here, and our midbrain, which would be down in this region. And the basal nuclei is important in motor function. And here's a different view of our basal nuclei. So it's showing you exactly where in the brain we're slicing here. So this would be the view that we're looking at. These darkened portions here are all nuclei. So the caudate nucleus, this putamen and globus pallidus, which both of those together creates your lentiform nucleus. All of those have to do with your basal nuclei. Again, really important for motor control. That's what I want you to know. Our limbic system has to do with emotion. It's a part of our cerebrum and diencephalon. It's where we have our basic survival functions such as memory, reproduction, and nutrition. We have our cingulate gyrus, our hippocampus, which would be down in here. I'm not going to have you identify these anywhere. Just know that these structures are involved in the limbic system. We do have various nuclei in the thalami too that are going to be involved in the limbic system, and they work with our basal nuclei, our hypothalamus, our olfactory cortex, and the fornix. And the fornix would be this right in here. And we see some of these structures in here. There's that cingulate gyrus. So we've sliced the brain this way in cross section. So this is looking at an anterior view, whereas this is looking at a lateral view. So cingulate gyrus, you're seeing this right in here, over here. We have that space that would be your lateral ventricle. That's what you see in white here. Below that would be the thalamus in this region. And then you have your hypothalamus below that. Let me see. There's nothing else I can really relate that we see up in here, but that's how they correlate. And this is another view of your limbic system. I won't go identifying all of these structures because we talked about them on the last slide. We already talked about meninges in chapter 12, but just as a reminder, these meninges also cover the brain itself to protect it. So that top layer after the skull, okay, so here's your scalp, here's your skull, this is your dura mater, this is your dura mater. Looks like the scalp and the skull are kind of still together. So here's your dura mater, here's your arachnoid mater, which would be the spider web connective tissue, and then right adhered on the brain itself would be the pia mater. All right, now let's talk about your ventricles. We have 4 ventricles total. All I want you to know about these ventricles is that they are an empty space in the brain, and it's going to contain something known as a choroid plexus, which is a network of capillaries, and they work to produce cerebrospinal fluid. The other thing I want you to know is that we have two, whoa, okay, that was totally off. We have two lateral ventricles, okay, and you could see them in blue here. We have one third ventricle and a fourth ventricle. And the way our cerebrospinal fluid moves is it gets formed first in these lateral ventricles. It's going to move through the interventricular foramen to the third ventricle. Then from there it moves through the cerebral aqueduct, or it's also known as the aqueduct of Sylvius, over to the fourth ventricle. And from there, you don't see it in this image, but we have 3 different apertures in which it can go and basically start coating the brain in this cerebrospinal fluid to nourish it. And the last place it moves out of is the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, so it can bathe the spinal cord as well. Blood supply to the brain. I need you to know that the brain needs a ton of blood. About 15 to 20% of our blood to the brain is pumped by the heart. If we have any interruption, a stopping of blood going to the brain, it leads to unconsciousness and irreversible brain damage. Because we have a high metabolic rate, we really need oxygen and glucose to reach the brain in order for it to function correctly. And some arteries that are going to work to supply this is going to be our internal carotids. The word carotid actually means to sleep because you find the carotids also in your neck. And I'll show you this in our cadaver lab. So if you put pressure on the carotid artery, that stops blood supply to the brain and causes somebody to pass out or to go to sleep. The vertebral arteries come off of the subclavian arteries, which are coming off of the aorta. So those are going to branch on up through the brainstem, creating the basilar artery. And then we have a circle created here called the Circle of Willis. And these are all cerebral arteries that are giving blood supply to the brain. So I don't want you to know too much detail on this for your exam. Just know the brain is supplied by the internal carotids and vertebral artery and serve as a part of the Circle of Willis, and it needs oxygen and glucose and lots of blood supply. This is kind of a review from chapter 11, your blood-brain barrier. Know that it's created by those glial cells, the astrocytes. They kind of put their foot processes on the capillaries within our brain to create tight junctions so that certain substances can't enter our bloodstream in our brain. And this is important to consider when we're developing drugs. All right, so cranial nerves. Like I said, I'm not going to test you heavily on this. I want you to know that cranial nerves are always referred to using Roman numeral numbers, and these were named based on location from anterior to posterior. So just to review Roman numerals, I means 1, X means 10, and V means 5. And anytime you put an I behind one of those letters like V or X, it's going to add in addition. So X would be 10, I would be 1, 1, so this would be 12. If I gave you an I and a V, okay, V meaning 5, I put this I before it, so that means you need to subtract. So this would be 4. And the other things I want you to know about cranial nerves is that it can have one or more of 3 functions. It could be a sensory cranial nerve, it could be a somatic motor cranial nerve, or it could be parasympathetic innervation. Okay. These following slides is extra information. So I'm leaving them in here for you, but I actually have a whole separate lecture on cranial nerves that I'm going to post just in case you're interested. But I won't be testing you on the cranial nerves specifically. Like I said, they're numbered 1 through 12. Know that. And if you have any more questions, please let me know. in the cadaver lab. I will see you then. Take care.